Hello, I'm Darryl Cross and I work as an executive and personal coach. In my coaching, because I'm also a clinical psychologist, a number of people come to me and often ask about how they can be more positive in what they say and what they think. How can I think more positive? How can I be more positive is the kind of request that I would often get. In other words, it's the old adage, how can I see the cup as half full rather than being half empty? And so what I need to describe to people is the way in which we think. And most people have never stopped to think about how they think. And so it is important to understand that process that occurs within us. And it occurs very quickly and very automatically, so often we don't quite understand how we are thinking and how thinking is so important to us and how we can control that thinking. Most people just think, well, it's automatic and that's the way I think. I've always thunk that way. So they then don't take time out to consider how they can actually get some control of that. So it's important that people understand this paradigm that I'm about to present. So what we need to understand is that out here in the wider world, there is always what I would call a trigger. There's something that happens out there, I call it step A, something that activates us and gets us thinking. And that might be an external event, it could be a phone call, it could be what someone says, it could be something that we see. But something triggers us, and there's always a trigger. Or the trigger could in fact be an internal event. We just might be driving along and get swept up in our own daydreams or stream of thoughts. Or we might be showering or shaving or applying makeup or whatever you happen to be doing, where you then have a stream of thoughts and you activate that internally. But there is always a trigger. There is always something that sets us off. Once that occurs, then we go to step B. And step B is our thoughts or our thinking. We then weigh up what we've seen or what we've observed or whatever it is that occurs over here. We give meaning to this particular trigger. We assess it, we analyse it, we weigh it up. And so that immediately means that our thinking is activated. And then as a result of our thinking, that then determines step C, which is our mood or our emotions. In other words, if I think happy thoughts, I feel happy. If I think angry thoughts, I feel angry. If I think sad thoughts, I feel sad, and so on. So what we need to understand is that often people come in to me as either a clinical psychologist or a coach, and they say, well, I know why I'm really angry. It's about my adolescent who won't do as I ask and is belligerent. Or I'm really ticked off because my spouse is spending too much money or not handling the budget appropriately. Or I'm really frustrated with the fact that my boss won't understand the work that I've got to do. And so normally most people don't have any issue about pointing to either A or C on this paradigm. They can frequently point to the trigger and they know how it impacts them. And I often say to them, I understand what the trigger is and I understand what you're feeling. What were you thinking to bring about this feeling? I mean, in some cases people will say to me, rare these days, but often they will say, in the past at least, I'm not thinking anything. And to them I have some bad news and I say, well, if you're not thinking anything, then basically you're dead. But I know they're not dead because they're sitting in front of me. So I say, well, you must be thinking something here, but what happens is you go from A to C in a split second. And in the same way, you can go from a molehill into a mountain in a split second because our thinking takes us that way. By the way, there is a step D. On the basis of our mood and our thoughts, then step D that occurs is how we act or how we behave. So the scenario is, if we really get here, to our mood and emotions, and it's a negative emotion, remember we're talking about negative self-talk, and it's a negative emotion, by that I mean it could be anger, or it might be feeling down or depressed, or it might be anxious. They're the big three. If we get to that point, then that should be our emotional guidance system, almost our radar system, that says we've come unstuck either here or here. Now, most people, in order to get rid of these emotions, will try to automatically go over here and change the trigger. So that's why they say, well, I'm not getting on in my marriage, I'm going to leave the marriage and try a new relationship. Or I don't like my job, I'm going to leave the job and try something else. Or I don't like this city, I'm going to live somewhere else. And often they try to change the trigger. And sometimes it is important to change that trigger. But in the main, what they take with them is their thinking pattern and their thinking style, which is usually negative. So it's not so much changing this mood or emotions by changing the trigger, it's more about changing the thinking. And so it's about positively thinking and flipping it around. And you know that you've been engaged in negative thinking because you're either feeling angry or depressed or anxious. They're the big three. And that's a signal that your thinking hasn't been correct. And what I suggest to most people is they carry around with them a little notepad or something that they can write down very, very quickly, just as they're going through the day's activities, anytime they might feel anger or depression or anxiety, or anytime they feel bad, virtually. Just write it down very, very quickly. So they write down the emotion, how am I feeling? I'm feeling angry. And then they write down the trigger, whatever it was. A client was upset with me, or a client was abusive on the phone. That's all they do. When they go home, they draw up a sheet that has the emotion on it and the trigger on it, and I ask them then to do step 3, which is really B on this paradigm, is to write down their thoughts. What were they thinking? What were they thinking during the day when they felt that emotion because of that trigger? And they write down the negative thoughts. They are negative. And then what I ask them to do, and I force them to actually then change it around and put it into positive thinking. When they write it down, the brain gets it. When you see it in black and white in front of you, your brain understands it. And if you did that seriously and took this on board and spent a few minutes each day, just a few seconds almost, to write down anytime you felt bad, and then spent 10 minutes a night actually going and writing down some positive thoughts in relation to the negative thoughts that you would have reactivated because you've thought about what happened during the day. You did that for about a 2-week period, you'd start to change your thinking from being negative into being much more positive, because your brain would start to understand there's a new pattern here. You've written it down, your brain gets it. I challenge you to do that for yourself, because it's really important that you begin to think positively and those around you start to think positively, because life takes on a rosier hue. And life is more easier to deal with when you see things in a positive light than in a negative light. So what would it take for you to undertake this little exercise? What would it take for you to spend a few seconds each day whenever you felt bad, writing something down on your little piece of paper, slipping it into your pocket, going home at night and spending 10 minutes, then reworking your thinking? What would it take? I give the challenge to you because I think in the long run it's really critical for all of us to think positively, because as I said, life is a heck of a lot easier to deal with when it is seen in a positive light.